Okay, so today we are going to do the last part of chapter 1. And we're going to go over the whole chapter, but we're not going to really focus in on any of the verses, really, like we did last week. But we are, so this is Gita from 0, number 24. And we are going to talk about sidebar stories, a little bit more. We didn't cover some of them last week. Philosophical foundations, names, and issues in the Bhagavad Gita. All right. Any questions before we even start? Just to see if anybody's got anything bubbling around in their consciousness.
I remember some of the last time you mentioned about people can exchange the places to fight.
Can do what? Yeah, exchange.
Switch. My question was about Bhishma.
Yeah.
Why he took the other place?
Why didn't he go fight on the other? Well, that's mentioned in Prabhupada's purports, that Bhishma was living in the court of Hastinapur. You know, the Pandavas never lived in the court of Hastinapur for very long. They lived in the forest. And then when they got old enough, and Pandu died, they went to Hastinapur for some time, you know, and they got trained and all that kind of thing. And then it was natural for them to want a kingdom, and Dhritarashtra gave them Khandavaprastha, which was kind of a desert, useless area, and because that was the nature of Dhritarashtra. So they went there, and after a short time it turned into a wonderful place, and then Duryodhana became envious. But all that time, Bhishma was always living in Hastinapur. The Pandavas had Khandavaprastha, and Duryodhana and Dhritarashtra and Bhishma, they lived in Hastinapur. So because he was living in the court of Hastinapur, he was that was his place of residence and everything. They were supporting him. He felt obliged to join on the side of the Kauravas. Maybe he should have changed sides, but at any rate, that's the way the cookie crumbled, at least the way we go here. So this is us here, 5.3, sidebar stories, philosophical tangents, philosophical foundations, names, issues in Bhagavad Gita, session 24. And next week, 5.10, we will begin chapter 2. Again, text 1 through 46, session 24. And these are our things we hope to cover, some more sidebar stories, some philosophical foundations, names, and issues in the Bhagavad Gita. Now, this is a list of some of the sidebar stories. Some of these I went over last week, so I'm not going to go over them again, like the story of Kurukṣetra. We discussed that last week. The history of the Kurus, we kind of have been discussing that all along. Number 3 here, Bhishma and Karna's enmity. You know, so just before the battle of Kurukṣetra started, you know, on the Kaurava side, in the Kaurava camp, what happened was that each of the main players on the Kaurava side said how long they thought the battle was going to take. And, you know, they estimated various different time periods. At the end, Karna came forward. And Karna said, the battle will only take 5 days. I'll do it all by myself. And at that, Bhishma laughed out loud. You know, he said that, Karna, you have no idea. You could say these kind of empty things when you're standing here in front of the whole phalanx of the soldiers that are on your side, but when you're in front of Arjuna and Bhima, it'll be a different story, believe me. And this, of course, offended Karna. So already the Kaurava side is getting off to a rocky start. So Bhishma and Karna were already there. Last week we talked about the rift between Drona and Drupad, how Drona was insulted by Drupad when he came to ask for half the kingdom when Drupad had promised it to him at a certain point, So he promised it, and then, of course, he was insulted. And then finally, Drona taught the Kauravas and the Pandavas, and the Pandavas conquered Drupad. And then that made, then Drona took half the kingdom, because now Drupad was subjected. And this made Drupad an enemy, and of course then he created a fire sacrifice that would let Drishtadyumna and Draupadi be born. So Drishtadyumna and Draupadi are born, and of course Drishtadyumna is born to kill Dronacharya, and Draupadi becomes the mutual wife of all the Pandavas. And then we have Drona teaching all the warriors, and then last week we also talked about Pandavas' experience, all 6 kinds of aggression. That was, we mentioned there were 6 kinds of aggressors. And the Kauravas performed each one of those 6 kinds of aggression on the Pandavas. So they were well within their rights to fight the Kauravas. So we also last week talked about Bhima's vows and the story of Vikarna. And we talked about Bhima meeting Hanuman. And we didn't talk about Yudhishthira insulting Arjuna, which was an interesting part. Of course, this happens in the battle, that there was a point where the Kauravas, they wanted to fight Yudhishthira. So at one point in the battle was going pretty intensely, and Yudhishthira is knocked unconscious. And Arjuna comes in and fights, and then I forget who removes Yudhishthira from the battlefield. And Yudhishthira wakes up back at the camp, and he's thinking, how did I get here? Oh, I was knocked out in the battle. So therefore, I wonder what happened later. And then Arjuna comes in after the battle's over, and Yudhishthira tells Arjuna, tell me, I forget who it was that knocked Yudhishthira unconscious, but Yudhishthira asks Arjuna, tell me how you killed him. And Arjuna said, well, I didn't kill him. I was just going to check on you to see if you were okay. And to that, Yudhishthira got very angry, and he said, what's the use of your Gandiva bow? You should throw it away. And he didn't know, Yudhishthira didn't know, that Arjuna had taken a vow that anyone who said something bad about his bow, or that he was, a useless fighter, he would kill that person. So now he's made that vow, he has to kill his brother. And so he's turning to Yudhishthira. Krishna knows all this. And then Krishna knows, okay, wait a minute, I got a solution. Hold up. So Krishna tells Arjuna, my dear Arjuna, I know you have made a vow. Yudhishthira doesn't know you've made a vow, that anybody who insults your bow and your use of it will be killed by you, or else Arjuna will enter fire, or he'll die himself. So he talks to Arjuna. He said, Arjuna, for a Kshatriya, to be insulted is worse than dying. So I suggest that instead of killing your brother Yudhishthira, that you insult him. And so this is what happens. Then Arjuna goes and insults Yudhishthira. And the whole situation is saved. But it was the quick thinking of Krishna that saved this whole situation. And number 12 here is Shalya joins the wrong side. That's another interesting story. Because Shalya was not at all on the side of the Kauravas. He wanted to fight on Arjuna and Krishna's side. So he was coming from his kingdom to travel to where the Pandavas were. On the way, on the side of the road, Duryodhana understood Arjuna was coming, and he set up pandals where not Arjuna, but where Shalya was coming. He has set up pandals. And, so Shalya would go there and he would have something nice to eat. He would be entertained, and all kinds of good accommodations there. He could stay the night there. And then they were asking where he would be the next day, and he would set up another pandal. But all the time, Duryodhana didn't show his face. So Shalya thought that this was Yudhishthira doing this, but it was actually Duryodhana doing this. And so after several times of this elaborate, arrangement for him, Shalya said, let me see that person, because he was sure it was going to be Yudhishthira. Let me see that person so I can embrace him and offer him my allegiance and, thank him so much. And he was shocked and surprised when instead of Yudhishthira, Duryodhana came out. So he had already said that, and he was pledged now to fight on the battle on the wrong side, on the side that he didn't want to fight on. He had come to join Yudhishthira and Arjuna's side, but now he's pledged to fight on the side of Duryodhana. But Shalya later on, because he was always partial to the Pandavas, as a Kshatriya he was duty-bound to fight to the death for Duryodhana and for the Kauravas. But actually, later on, he becomes a chariot driver of Karna, and he's insulting Karna while they're fighting on the same side. So this kind of makes a bad mental impression on Karna, and this helps the Pandavas. So at any rate, that's what happens later on. We did talk about the dice game and the terms, and this is an interesting thing. 14, Kunti tries to sway Karna. So what has happened is that we understand that before the birth of the 5 Pandavas, Kunti, as a little girl, had been given a mantra by Durvasa Muni, and that mantra was designed to call a demigod. So she was a little girl. She pleased Durvasa, which is hard to do, because Durvasa Muni is really a cantankerous kind of person. But she pleased him, and he said, I will give you this mantra, and when you utter it, you can call a demigod. What he didn't tell Kunti Devi was that when the demigod comes, he will give you a child. He didn't tell her that part. And the reason he didn't tell her that part is he knew in the future, Durvasa knew in the future, she would be married to Pandu. And Pandu would be cursed that he couldn't have children in the normal way, because he had shot a sage and his wife enjoying, and they were actually in the form of deer. So Pandu didn't know that they were human, but they had taken the form of deer, and they were enjoying sex in the forest, and that's when Pandu shot them. And so the sage cursed Pandu that if he should ever approach his own wife, he would die too, just like he had killed them. So Pandu knew that he couldn't have sex with his wife, or else he would be immediately finished. So at any rate, Durvasa knew all this. This was years in the future yet. And he gave Kunti this strange benediction. So of course Kunti just thought, well, let me check this mantra out to see if it actually works. And so she called the sun god, and then the sun god appeared before Kunti Devi and said, I have come and I am going to give you a child. And Kunti said, wait a minute, I didn't know that was part of the whole thing. And he said, well, don't worry, the child will come from your ear, you'll remain a virgin. And so that's why Karna is called Karna, because instead of the usual way, these are demigods, they're able to override the normal processes of nature. And so as a result, Karna was born from the ear of Kunti. And then the demigod of the sun, Surya, went back. And as a result, suddenly Kunti was left with this child. What could she do? She wasn't married. She knew this was like the worst thing that could happen to a lady back then, is to be pregnant and have a child and not have a husband, you know. So what she did was she put Karna in a floating basket with some sealant so that it wouldn't fall under the water, and she put him into the Ganges, and Karna drifted downstream, and later he was found by Adirat and his wife, and they raised Karna, and he never knew that he was actually Kunti's first child. Later on, Kunti gets married to Pandu, and the Pandavas are born. But of course, before the Battle of Kurukṣetra, Kunti goes to Karna, and she meets Karna in a secluded place, and she says, my dear Karna, you don't know, but actually you are my firstborn, and that the other Pandavas are all junior to you. You're about to fight this Battle of Kurukṣetra, but if you come to the Pandava side, you will be the king apparent, because you're the eldest son, actually. So Yudhisthira and Arjuna and all the rest will accept that. So please come to the Pandava side and forgive me for not telling you this, or for allowing this whole thing to happen. And Karna is very angry. He says, you know, what kind of mother are you? You put me in a basket, gave me up, and and now I've made friends with Duryodhana, and he is like a brother to me, and the Pandavas are my enemies. Even though she told him all these things, Karna couldn't bear to change sides and come to the Pandava side, even if it meant being king and the whole thing, you know. So he did not switch sides. He stayed on the side of the Pandavas. Now what's interesting is, as the battle is fought, only Karna knows that, of course Kunti knows too, only Karna knows that the Pandavas are actually his brothers, you know. And this weighs on Karna's mind. Later on, after the battle, Arjuna and Yudhisthira find out that Karna was actually their brother, and they become very angry, you know. And so, anyway, this was kind of the whole secret. And last week we talked about Bhima rejecting begging. That was a process. Yes.
Even Krishna tried to persuade Karna also to join the Pandavas, but even Krishna was not successful.
Right. So it just shows that sometimes hatred is thicker than love, you know. So, or even family relations. So, the fact that Karna was very egotistical, and the fact that Karna was already connected with Duryodhana, that he couldn't switch sides. So I wanted to kind of bring these out because we're going to leave chapter 1 with chapter 2 when we start that one, and then we're going to leave most of this Mahābhārata stuff behind, and because it'll just be Arjuna and Krishna talking about philosophy, and that goes all the way on to the 18th chapter, as we say. I've been learning a lot by trying to do this whole program. I'm trying to tie all these different pieces together, And it's actually kind of fascinating. So we've kind of covered what I call the story narrative. So we've talked about how the story of the Battle of Kurukṣetra unfolded, who were the characters, what were their relationships to one another, how did they get to be where they are. But now we're going to talk about some of the topics that are more philosophical, but they're the philosophical narrative, not the story narrative, the philosophical narrative. And so we see that at the very beginning, we have Dhritarashtra and Sanjaya talking about the Kurukṣetra's influence. Dhritarashtra is worried about it, and we spent some time talking about that. The Kurukṣetra was a very sacred place, and that would be good for the Pandavas and bad for the Kauravas, because the Kauravas weren't pious. Then, we hear about the compromise, and this is what Dhritarashtra was worried, that maybe either the Pandavas or the Kauravas would compromise. He wouldn't mind it if the Pandavas would compromise and give up the battle, but he didn't want the Kauravas to do that. He wanted to be sure that his own sons would fight and therefore beat the Pandavas, And then we have Bhishma's mistake, and that gets brought out kind of in the midway, where we hear that Duryodhana reminds Bhishma. Actually, it should be, what I really should have said was Drona's mistake. That's my mistake. Chandra's mistake. So, anyway, it should have been Drona's mistake, because what Duryodhana makes mention of is the fact that Drona had taught the Pandavas, and then he had taught Drishtadyumna, and he shouldn't have taught Drishtadyumna, because now Drishtadyumna is on the other side, and he could be killed as a result of that. So that was what I was actually referring to there. And of course, we hear about the justification of the battle. That's when Arjuna has all these doubts, and we discussed that he had 5 categories of doubt, which I call sedfi, compassion, the enjoyment, destruction of dynasty, fear of sinful reaction. Finally, the I is indecision. Yeah.
I have a question. So, since Krishna deals with all the doubts of Arjuna, but there is one doubt: destruction of family tradition. And whatever Arjuna explains as his reason, that actually happens. So the Kshatriyas are killed, and then there is nobody to protect the women. So how do we?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's actually, I never thought from that angle. I'll have to think about that for a while. That's a good realization.
I have another question, Maharaj. So usually Buddhism lists 5 reasons.
Yeah.
One of them is indecision.
Yeah.
So in my mind, indecision is rather a consequence of Arjuna's bewilderment, which is, and the reasons for this are described in the first verse. So isn't it? Well, this is not actually a reason for. I mean, this is just a.
Well, it's indecision on Arjuna's part. Certainly, it's not indecision on Krishna's part. Yeah. What I find interesting is that all these mental difficulties about the Battle of Kurukṣetra are happening to Arjuna before the battle, but they happen to Yudhishthira after the battle. So just like Arjuna is bewildered before he fights, Yudhishthira becomes bewildered after the battle is completed, because he thinks he's personally responsible for all these 650 million soldiers being killed. He thinks exactly almost the same reasons that Arjuna has before the battle, Yudhishthira has after the battle. And nobody can change his mind, and that's why, of course, finally Yudhishthira has to go and hear from Bhishma-Dev, who's dying on the bed of arrows. And Bhishma-Dev finally convinces, actually at the end of the battle, Yudhishthira wants to just stop eating and give up his life, because he feels that that's proper penance for all he's done wrong, So, at any rate, eventually, Bhishma-Dev convinces him that that's not the right thing to do. So all the way along, we're hearing about, is this battle justified or not? We discussed early on in the introduction phase, it happened before we started chapter 1, about this concept that every possible means for negotiation had been tried by various people, Vedavyas and, other people tried to negotiate. Even Krishna made a last-ditch attempt to try to broker some kind of compromise between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And when all that failed, then there was only one course, and that was the battle, and that's what actually happened. And as we see here, destruction of family is a key thing, that this was what Arjuna is trying to explain, and this is one of the reasons he uses. And Krishna will, of course, during the course of this battle, deconstruct these various pleas that Arjuna has. Of course, partly Krishna has come, as we know, in the Bhagavad Gita, that Dharma samstapanartaya sambhavami yuge yuge. So he comes to reestablish Dharma, but he also comes to annihilate the miscreants and to actually give a pleasure to the devotees. So these are the Kauravas are kind of, when Krishna was a little baby, he was basically born to rid the world of the bellicose demoniac forces that had come from the lower heavenly worlds where the demons are, because they wanted to attack the heavenly planets. So that's why Krishna was born. This is all in Bhagavatam. It's not in Bhagavad Gita, but it's all in Bhagavatam. So when Krishna was born, he killed so many demons one by one, these various demons that Kamsa sent to try to find him as a little baby. He wiped them out, and then later as a young man. And then, he killed Kamsa and his cohorts later on as a, youth. And then during the flow of his life, Krishna killed more and more of these demons, or was involved in having them killed. Finally, we get to this Kurukṣetra war, where Krishna says, okay, I'm just going to do a wholesale deal here. I'm just going to get them all together in one place. And this is why the Battle of Kurukṣetra happened, because he kind of rounded them up. And as well, Krishna put in some of his own family members, because he knew that they would be too powerful and create problems on the earth. And later on, then Krishna finishes off the rest of his family members at the fratricidal war at Samanta Panchaka. So that's later on after the Battle of Kurukṣetra. So, at any rate, that's a little bit of the topics. These are kind of the philosophical, what's actually talked about in the Bhagavad Gita. Kurukṣetra's influence is talked about by Sanjaya, and Dhritarashtra, the war compromise, is inferred by Dhritarashtra. Drona's mistake is spoken of by Duryodhana. The justification of the battle is actually spoken of by Arjuna, and the destruction of family. Arjuna is mentioned. These are all things that actually come up in the dialogue. Now, these are some of the philosophical tangents that are discussed at some point or another. I'll discuss these very briefly, at least some of them. Some of them we've already talked about. Reasons for the battle we've already talked about. We wanted to coalesce these, and Burijan does this in his book, Surrender Unto Me, which is his exegesis or his unpacking of the Bhagavad Gita, which is very wonderful. And, he lists these 5 reasons for the battle. Now, Arjuna's relatives and the fact that many of them will die is an interesting thing. This is a philosophical tangent. Arjuna is on the battlefield and he's talking to Krishna. But ostensibly, most of us are not soldiers. And most of us are not on a battlefield. Rather, we're regular people. But Bhagavad Gita is supposed to be for everyone. So how does this work? Arjuna is in a very specific situation. He's on a battlefield and he's fighting his relatives. And how does this tie in to everyday you and me? So what I wanted to highlight here is that Arjuna is fighting something that at the same time he loves. So this is what makes the Battle of Kurukṣetra difficult. And this is where it refers to all of us, because in the process of extricating ourselves from the material world, we have to fight things that actually we wish we didn't have to fight. We would rather embrace them. So now you were starting to see how this Arjuna situation, which seems to be a very specific sort of situation, is actually a generic situation for all human beings, whether they're men or women or whether they were soldiers or whatever. You have a question?
Is that what we would call detachment?
Yeah, right.
Being someplace but being detached.
Right.
So,
well, the particular thing we're talking about here is that that's what makes this situation sticky for Arjuna. He's no stranger to war, and he's fought so many battles and so many very serious enemies, But in this particular situation, the one thing that's very different is he has to fight people he loves and respects. So similarly, in the process of becoming devotees, we have to fight the desires within our heart that we know we have to get rid of, but we really don't want to. So this is the plight of a devotee, that we gradually become convinced that to gain spiritual upliftment, that there are some desires that have to go. And also, most devotees have experienced that there are some friendships that have to go when we become involved in spiritual life. And this is not a happy or easy process because we are at war with ourselves. So that's a philosophical tangent, and I wanted to highlight that. And, Kshatriya code. So the Kshatriyas have a code of fighting. And we learned some things about it in the Bhagavad Gita, that Kshatriyas only fight with similar weapons. If one Kshatriya loses the weapons, the other one doesn't take advantage. That they, fight in a battlefield, and it's illegal to use mystic weapons against ordinary soldiers, and a person who lays down their life on the battlefield and is killed by the enemy immediately gets access to the heavenly worlds. All these things are there. So this is kind of something that we hear about. We'll hear a little bit more about this in chapter 2. We'll hear about Kshatriya code, when one of the reasons Krishna uses to get Arjuna to fight is what Kshatriyas are supposed to do. Kshatriyas are supposed to be chivalrous. They never retreat. They understand Shastra, and they attack and perform violence only when necessary, when it's on proper grounds. And of course, we already talked about the 6 aggressors, which are not mentioned directly in Bhagavad Gita, but Prabhupada mentions them in the purport, so that comes up. The conch shells, again, it's mentioned that they're blown, and only we get that the hearts of the Kurus are shattered, but in the purport, Prabhupada elaborates on that a little bit more. So this is kind of a philosophical elaboration. Omens is something we're going to see throughout the entire Bhagavad Gita, actually, and the Bhagavatam as well, that there are portents or things which presage what will happen next. We heard that when, the conch shells are blown. That's our first introduction to an omen, that the conch shells being blown, it's shattering the hearts of the Kurus. It basically is saying that we wonder who's going to win, but this is suggesting that it's going to be the Pandavas and not the Kauravas. So here's another philosophical tangent that isn't discussed directly, at least here. In chapter 2 it comes out a little bit more, that the reason Arjuna doesn't want to fight Drona and Bhishma is they're like his teachers, they're his superiors, and he feels that is sinful in itself. Even if they are wrong, it's wrong to disrespect a teacher. Of course, what's interesting is we'll find out when you get into the Mahābhārata, after Bhagavad Gita is spoken, that before the battle starts, Yudhisthira rounds up the Pandavas, and the Pandavas walk across the chasm between the two armies, and they go right to the camp of Bhishma Dev. They're walking through the Kaurava army. They're about to fight. They're walking through the enemy army. And when they get to Bhishma Dev, at that point, Yudhisthira says, "My dear grandsire Bhishma, I beg you to have permission from you to fight you, because otherwise I will incur sinful action." And Bhishma Dev said, "It's good that you've come to me like this, because if you had not, I would have certainly cursed you. But yes, I give you permission to fight and defeat me." So he gets permission, and then they go to Drona and the same thing. So Yudhisthira actually, deals with this aspect, in Mahābhārata. And of course, Varnashram Dharma is a big story, and that comes up a lot of times later on in the Bhagavad Gita, that there are 4 Varnas and 4 ashrams. In the modern day, this is misrepresented as the caste system of modern India, which is not at all what Varnashram is. But we'll talk about that, as we get to it. But these are some of the philosophical tangents. Varna Sankara, which means unwanted population. This is what Arjuna is worried about, that if the men are killed, the women will not have husbands to help bring up the children, and as a result there will be unwanted population. Of course, after the Pandavas go, this is Kali Yuga coming in, and this makes it possible for a lot of unwanted population like you and me and all the rest of us to get born in this planet, So then we have, of course, degradation of womanhood. This is one of Arjuna's points that he's making, and this isn't described greatly, but that's the idea of degradation of womanhood, that women will have no husbands. Some of them may decide to remarry or have relationships on the side, or have illegitimate children, and this is which will contribute to Varna Sankara. So these two things go together. We won't say much about that right now, but eventually as we go through Bhagavad Gita, we'll focus on that particular tangent. And then we have, of course, Arjuna's reasons to not fight the battle. And then we talked a little bit about violence, and we talked about karma and sin and how those are interrelated. That will be another major theme that will be later on in Bhagavad Gita as we get into chapter 2 and beyond. So we were talking about the 10 just now. These are I think of them as the philosophical underpinnings, because if we understand these concepts, then the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita becomes fairly easy to grasp. And for someone who has a very different opinion about any of these concepts, they will find Bhagavad Gita totally opaque and they won't be interested in it. And they'll lose their interest in Bhagavad Gita. Because if one doesn't accept free will, then Bhagavad Gita doesn't make any sense at all, and nor does anything in our world for that matter. If one doesn't understand the concept of karma, then one will also think that this is all some kind of ancient fable and nothing more. Or many people come to Bhagavad Gita with the idea that the Bhagavad Gita can be interpreted in millions of different ways. And indeed it can be, but there's one way that actually ties it together as a consistent whole, whereas other interpretations splinter it and make it useless. In many philosophy courses in colleges, naturally, they teach all these odd, interpretations of Gita. And yeah, you can interpret it in so many different ways, and there's so many authors who have interpreted it in various ways. But if you're going to get anything out of the Gita, what the Gita is really intended to do is give you an entire presentation of a worldview, and that means it has to be consistent. These other interpretations do not give you a consistent worldview, and therefore Gita just becomes kind of an ancient, like Aesop's fables or something like that, an ancient collection of self-help hints, or techniques or something like that. And of course, we're going to talk about in a minute fundamental axioms. And materialism, if one doggedly holds to materialism, one will also not get very far with Bhagavad Gita. Immediately you will start to think, well, all these strange things, they can't be real, they can't be true, and because they can't be true, this book is just, some fable from an ancient world that didn't have science behind it, didn't understand how to look at things in a critical way, in a systematic way. And this is all because the lens of materialism blots out the real effort or the real essence of Bhagavad Gita. And, we've already talked a little bit about love, freedom, and happiness and how they're generally misunderstood. So if one misunderstands love or misunderstands freedom or misunderstands happiness, these three words will kind of be like tying your shoelaces together as you're trying to walk through the Bhagavad Gita. They'll cause you to stumble. So let me say a few more quick things about some of these. So the most important of these is 4 fundamental axioms. We have said before, and this is probably one of the most important points to grasp, that there is no philosophy on this earth, whether it's atheistic or non-atheistic, whether it's ancient or modern, whether it's one religion or another religion, or whatever you want to say. There's no philosophy on earth that proves everything. Because our world is designed in such a way that certain fundamental things have to be accepted before we can build a philosophy. Those we call axioms. Even in mathematics, or in particularly geometry, you have these axioms like the straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. No one will argue that, basically. But unless you accept it, you can't use it to build higher axioms in geometry. And similarly in mathematics, that if you add 1 to any integer, you get the next integer. You know, I mean, nobody's going to argue with that. It's pretty straightforward. But you can use that later on to build more difficult and intricate proofs on the mathematical level. So in a similar way, we take certain fundamental axioms, and these fundamental axioms cannot be proven themselves, but they have to be accepted. And then once they're accepted, then you can use those axioms to build proofs and explanations and various other higher concepts that pull those axioms together and work on them. So materialism has certain axioms that it holds absolutely true. And if you also hold those axioms as absolutely true, Bhagavad Gita won't go anywhere in your consciousness or in your mind. You know, one of the things that the materialistic axiom is that there are laws. We call those the laws of physics. Those never change, and they're absolute. Now, most materialists absolutely believe that. On the spiritual side, we don't believe that at all. We believe that the laws are given by a lawmaker, by the Supreme Lord, and therefore those laws are open to be shifted or even bypassed, if necessary, by the Supreme Lord. He doesn't do it very often, but he can do it. And we don't even know whether these laws of physics that we now hold as absolute were the same way in the ancient past. There's no proof of that. There's no proof that the laws of physics are the same throughout the entire universe. People take it as a given fact, but there's no proof to it. It's an axiom. So if you accept it, then you can build a materialistic interpretation of the world. If you reject it, then you can't build a materialistic explanation of the world. And just yesterday, I read this really brilliant thing by Hridayananda Swami, where he was talking about this whole idea that in colleges, they say that we cannot examine non-materialistic philosophies because that's religion. So if we're going to talk about science and we're going to talk about philosophies, they have to have materialism as their basis. So that's all well and good. But if you accept materialism, then you reject anything that is non-material, like, say, paranormal things, like the soul, like consciousness. All these things are non-material phenomenon. So if you're going to reject them because they're not materialistic, that's okay. But then you can't claim to have a complete philosophy because you've rejected certain things. So as Akundati says, that science works because it sacrifices scope for clarity. So you are rejecting certain things so that you can be clear on the things that you accept. And that's all. We don't have any problem with that. But then you can't say that you're talking about everything. There are certain things that you're not talking about. So, and similarly, if we have this scientific idea that by making a statement that only material things are real and that we can't accept religious statements, you are making a statement that is a religious statement, basically. Because for religion to be X'd out, you're saying that it doesn't exist. That's a religious statement. Similarly, if you accept materialism, then you are making a statement about the existence of something. So you're making a broad ontological or existential statement that materialist things exist, spiritual things or religious things are all guesswork or smoke and mirrors or whatever it is. So in that way, you are actually making a religious statement, and you need to support it on some kind of religious grounds. It's a philosophical statement. It's not a scientific statement. So it goes outside. So again, I bring this up because in the long run, we have an explanation of the world which bases everything on certain axioms. We believe that the atoms and energies of our world are atoms and energies that are really Krishna's energies. That's what their basis is. And this is not a real world. This world is semi-real. What happens here is, of course, important, but we are not these bodies. And this world is like a virtual reality. And if you want, the Vedas teach us, you can stay in the virtual reality as long as you want. And you will always be subject to the laws of karma. You'll get kicked around, and you'll get some, a few pieces of candy and some cherries here and there, but mostly you'll get kicked around. And you can go on doing that lifetime after lifetime. But when you finally get tired of it, you wonder, well, what's outside? There's another world outside. And another world outside is the spiritual world, which we cannot see directly through our senses. We can only see it and encounter it when we purify our senses, and that's done by spiritual life. So, any questions about that part of the presentation? We'll return to some of these things because that's why I wanted to focus on philosophical underpinnings, because with these concepts, if you can understand them or you appreciate them, then understanding Bhagavad Gita will go pretty smoothly. And you'll be able to, but if you disagree fundamentally with any of these things, then for the most part, Bhagavad Gita is just going to leave you with a kind of an interesting fable from an ancient time with maybe some truisms or shibboleths that could help us in everyday life, and that's about as deep as it gets, But that's not the real purpose of Bhagavad Gita. The purpose of Bhagavad Gita is to change your entire life and your entire view of the world that we live in. And that's what makes Bhagavad Gita special. Otherwise, it's just an old book, like any other. Yes.
Thank you, Maharaj. I was wondering if someone says, okay, so that means your faith is based on these fundamental axioms. So that means your belief actually is like your faith is blind faith.
Yeah,
How
right.
can we answer to
Right,
this?
right. Because there is no proof of any fundamental axioms, but there is evidence. And so some people will accept the evidence and some won't. We say that that there are such things as non-material causes and effects. For one, Akantati brings this up a lot, that consciousness is a non-material cause and effect. Who can deny that consciousness makes things happen? Because I desire to do something, I do something. As I was saying the other day, the Second World War, why did it happen? It wasn't because of electricity. It wasn't because of strong force or weak force. It wasn't because of gravity. It happened because of human will, which obviously reshaped the entire earth, at that time in the time that the Second World War took its place. So obviously, consciousness is a force. It has tangible effects on the outside world. Now, maybe scientists don't know how that force integrates into the everyday forces that we know and that scientists study. But we say that there are such extra non-material forces, and consciousness, human desire are an example of them. Very simple, nothing woo-woo about it. It's really, very straightforward. Now, one can follow that logic, but we can't prove that. But neither can you prove that it's not true. The scientists or the materialists really can't prove that the same laws of nature exist all over the universe. It's accepted as a basic article of faith. The other thing about science is based on the inductive method. What is the inductive method? The inductive method is that we do an experiment and we decide whether it's like this or it's like that, So we do an experiment over and over again, how many moles of oxygen, how many moles of hydrogen do we need for water, we do it over and over again. Okay, so we find out that it's a certain ratio. And we may have done that 10 times, it may have been done thousands of times all over the earth. And so we put it out there. This is the chemical reaction, H2 plus O equals H2O, And it's accepted. It's a scientific thing. But under some circumstances, maybe that doesn't happen. Maybe they're very unusual circumstances. And so it's like the white-black swan concept, that even though there are lots and lots of instances of white swans, it doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as a black swan. So no matter how many times you prove a scientific formula or a scientific verity, a formula, an equation, or what it is, there's always a possibility that there may be some circumstances under which it doesn't hold. And for this reason, science is always a little bit open-ended, because they know nothing can be absolutely proven, because the inductive method works like that. The deductive method doesn't, but the inductive method does. And science is based on the inductive method. So nothing in science can be absolutely proven. You can't prove that when you get down to the level of, quarks at this point, and leptons, that they don't go any deeper. Some say they're strings, and some say that those really don't exist. And who's to say that in another 50, 100 years they won't come up with something more, So in this way, everything's up for grabs. But if you want to build a consistent philosophy, Willard Van Orman Quine talked about something called a web of, understanding, or a web of philosophical or scientific thinking, where one thing supports another, and because they support one another, we have some faith in them, which is what we were talking about the other day with foundationalism, where one truth is consistent with another truth, is consistent with another truth. So you have a sort of, like an artist has a palette. He has certain colors that he's using and certain colors he's not going to use. So this is like our palette. We have to start somewhere. So similarly, scientists have to start somewhere. If you don't accept the inductive method, then you don't get anywhere with science. If you don't accept the process of, the idea that the principles of nature are the same all over the world, it's very hard to make any definite statements in science. So they accept it. But there's no proof for any of those things. They just have to accept it. Similarly, we make these statements like there's such a thing as free will, there's karma, the Supreme Lord exists. We can't prove them, but neither can someone prove the opposite thing. But we're building an entire worldview or philosophy based on those foundational principles, and the materialistic people are building a different worldview based on their materialistic foundations. And so what we call axioms can only be looked at, and you could have a reaction to them, and you can see where is there some evidence in the world that suggests they're true. So that's the best you can get. You can't make a definite proof for them, nor can you make a definite proof against them. Yes.
Like when you're explaining that, it seems like we are like in a dark place, and whenever we get a little bit of light and we we put the light and we are feeling everything. So we are telling all the other people, okay, I found this. Like the scientists feel like that.
Right.
So then we're thinking, okay, one pillar comes and there's another, like we are in this room and there's another pillar after 1 foot. And so we keep assuming that every 1 foot there is another pillar. So they are just like in a dark, and whatever they find, they tell each other consistently, and then that's how they are trying to learn about this universe.
Right.
So that's the inductive process.
Yeah, well, it's something like that. Thomas S. Kuhn, in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, really lays it out in detail. And many scientists hate that book because it explains there are two kinds of science. There's normal science and exceptional science. I forget what word he uses about it. Normal science means that you accept all the stuff that other scientists have found and you don't question it. And that's what 99% of the time scientists do. When a scientist wants to find a new kind of rubber that lasts better on highways, or when a scientist wants to find a better way to make a maglev, maglev train, or when a scientist wants to investigate how to fertilize crops better, all these things, they accept all the stuff that's already been discovered and done, and they don't question it, they just accept it and they try to build something. But occasionally, as time moves on, there are these anomalous things that don't fit the mold. And this creates a dissonance in science, where some people are wondering, well, for years and years we've accepted this truth in science. We've accepted it, but maybe under certain circumstances it doesn't work. Maybe there's something more. And whenever you do that, there are always those scientists say, no, it does actually work. And so there's a fight between the two groups. And this is called exceptional science, where now you're not trying to decide, how to make a better rubber, how to fertilize better. You're talking about actual scientific principles. Is it really like this, or is there something else going on? This is what's called a paradigm shift, where there were many anomalies during the time of Albert Einstein about the nature of the electromagnetic spectrum. There was a thing called the ultraviolet catastrophe. I don't have time to get into that. But the idea was that during that time, they had a certain paradigm or view of how things work at the atomic level. How does energy interact with matter? And later on, it was discovered that it works with quanta, which was a completely different idea. Nobody had ever thought of that before. And at first, there was a lot of resistance to it. And then finally, now, everybody accepts it. So before it was a non-thing, and now it's a thing. With Einstein, he came up with relativity, first general relativity, then later specific relativity, so special relativity. So he started off with this idea that as you go faster in the world, you start to go slower in time. And so this means that something's very strange here, and many people didn't believe it, but eventually general relativity and specific relativity nailed down some of these things and made explanations that now we accept, but we didn't at another time. So sometimes people feel science is like a big room where somebody comes and brings a new idea and puts it there, and then somebody else brings another idea and puts it there, and then somebody else brings another idea and puts it there. Nothing ever goes out of the room. People just come and bring new ideas, but that's not actually how science works. Sometimes whole groups of things get thrown out of the room and a new thing comes in that replaces those things that were once there. And this is called, exceptional science. That's what Thomas S. Kuhn talks about. So, and there's no knowing when somebody's going to come up with something that just rewrites a bunch of the books, and nothing can be done about it. And that's why all scientific knowledge is kind of up for grabs. We don't know what's there. So what Bhagavatam and what Bhagavad Gita give us is a certain set group of axioms. And if you accept those axioms, you can explain so much about the world. I mean, we can't personally prove or evaluate each one, but if we accept them, and we can look at them and see, do they seem reasonable? And usually in Bhagavad Gita and Bhagavatam, there's reasons given why these things sound and they seem reasonable. But you can build a consistent worldview. But with the materialistic view, you get this constantly shifting thing where some things disappear, and so on and so forth. Because there's no consistent axioms. Even the axioms themselves sometimes change. That's what Einstein did, and that's what happened with Max Planck and the quantum theory, where that caused some of the basic axioms of materialistic science to get removed and something else replaced. And like a house of cards, everything based on them got reevaluated. Of course, it was reevaluated and they found it to be much more accurate than it was before. And that's why people now have faith in relativity, and why they have faith in quantum physics. All right. Any other? Yes, Tulsi.
It's more like a technical question, Maharaj.
Yeah.
You mentioned how many soldiers died on the battlefield. Like Srila Prabhupada also writes in Bhagavad Gita, 650 million.
Yeah, right.
But then in Mahābhārata itself, there is the description how big is one Akshohini.
Yeah.
And then if you count it to 18 Akshohinis, actually it comes maybe 4, 5, 6 million, something like that.
Oh, really?
So I just want to ask if you can say something.
I've never done that calculation. I'll have to look into that and see if I get a
Maybe later you can.
Right. Sometimes, these questions, they require some, further research. I try to actually look into these things because I think they're important, because eventually it's important to, as much as possible, have some reasons and reasonable explanations for things which seem either unusual or paradoxical or whatever. Okay, so the final thing here, I'm getting over time again, I'll just do this very quickly, is the names in Bhagavad Gita. So we know that in Sanskrit, these words have a meaning. They're not just names. So the Pandavas means descendants of Pandu. So Pandu is a name. That's his actual name. And in Sanskrit, there are derivations that when a person's descendants, the vowels change. Like the Pandavas become the descendants of Pandu become Pandavas, so the U changes to an A, and we have this shift. Similarly, when Arjuna is related to by Krishna as a son of Kunti, he becomes Kaunteya, so the U changes to an AU. And this is a way that the descendants of somebody are addressed. They're addressed by their progenitors, and there is a what we call a phonological morphing of usually the vowels in the name. We have many such examples of that. We have Varshneya, so this is a descendant of Vrishnis. This is another example of that. So the R with the dot under it is a R, and it morphs into an AR here, and it becomes Varshneya. And we have Krishna being called by various names, which show that the name has shifted by a phonological change in this way. We relate to it, so I just wanted to make mention of that. So Pandavas are descendants of Pandu. The sons of Dhritarashtra are sometimes called Dhartarashtra, so the Drit becomes a D-A-R, just like Varshnaya from the R becomes an A-R, So the Dhartarashtras are directly the sons of Dhritarashtra. So Bhishma means terrible vow. We talked about that the other day. I won't go any deeper. Janardana. Interesting, in Bhagavad Gita, Burijan mentions that Janardana means either maintainer of all or person killer. Two very opposite meanings for the same name. What happens in Sanskrit, which doesn't happen it happens phonologically when people speak, but not in writing in our modern languages. But when there's an A at the end of the word and an A at the beginning of the word, those two morph together and become a large A. So this is called a strengthening of the vowel. So sometimes the ending of one meets, and that's called a sandhi, the beginning of another. But when we see a large A, that could be two small A's that merged and made a large A, or it could be a small A and a large A that merged and made a large A, or it could have been a large A and a small A that merged and made a large A, or it could have been two large A's that merged and made a large A. So all those possibilities are there, and therefore, depending on how you understand the word to have been formed, then you can get these strange and sometimes diverse meanings from the same name or the same word. So Madhava means the husband of the goddess of fortune. So anyway, this kind of gets occasionally brought up in Bhagavad Gita, this idea of morphing of names. And I'm not going to get into this. We don't have time for it. But this will come up again and again. And these are the issues in chapter 1. And we will meet some of the same ones, and we'll drag some of these all the way through Bhagavad Gita. And next week, here is our 5:10. We're going to break into Bhagavad Gita chapter 2. And we'll be talking about Arjuna's further doubts and surrender, and probably some more things, but right now that's as far as I've gotten in there. So this is our coming sessions. Any final questions or comments? Okie doke. So thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Hare Krishna.